Hmm. Hi, everybody. This is John Young. I am the co-founder of the Living Connection First Village Project, also the creator of something called the Eight Shields, Nature Connection Modeling, and 512 Project. So I also work closely as a partner with Peter and Lonner for Legacy Tracks, where we offer regenerative family dynamics for family nature retreats. Yeah, I'm very interested not only in what helps people connect to nature, but what helps people connect to themselves and to other people. Because in my years, 40 years of doing research and development and, teaching practical models in community, I pretty much discovered that people will only go as far on nature connection journey as their social constructs support. But that if they do go on a nature connection journey, their social scores increase. I'll call it a positive feedback loop, right? When you connect with nature, you develop a lot of things like empathy, et cetera. That helps you be better at connecting with people. So this positive feedback loop, one supports the other, and they have to be done in concert. So that's what I specialize in. And I've trained people all over the world in this. I'm considered a master tracker, wildlife tracker, bird language expert, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm really interested in how the tools of connection can help rebuild family unity, community unity, team unity, et cetera. Over the years, I got to know my friend here, John Arnold. I think we met back in 1999 or so, maybe even a little earlier. Um, while we were about to run an art of mentoring where we teach these connection tools in the context of nature connection, and I'm talking about the people connection tools. And John told me what he did, and I'm like, oh my God, I think you'd be really interested in this workshop. So he flew out to the Midwest, and we were there in I think we were in Michigan somewhere,
Mhm.
Ann Arbor or something, or we might have been in Minnesota, Wisconsin. I don't know, but I was teaching all over the place.
Wisconsin. Yeah.
Wisconsin. Okay, there we go. And yeah, John was just really a fantastic contributor from the beginning. We stayed friends. We stayed in touch. He's been at multiple courses that I've run, and he's helped to teach many of the courses that I run. And I'll let John tell you a little bit about him because he's a person where, I'm kind of a theorist. I get to train trainers and train community leaders and work with families, but John's on the ground. I mean, he's on the ground day in and day out. He's actually having to deal with the failure of connection or connection that was there and then suddenly wasn't, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And then how connection tools can bring that back. So John, tell folks a little bit about what you do.
Yeah. Well, I'm a ordained pastor in the Presbyterian Church. I've been doing this for just over 30 years now with my wife, who's also an ordained pastor, Susan. Right now, we pastor separate churches, but we seem to eat and breathe ministry and dealing with people's broken connection almost every day, around the table and at work, and it's a constant conversation in the back of our minds because we deal with people in crises. So we deal with people when they're experiencing death and loss, when they're facing divorce or struggles in their marriages, when they have tragedy happen, whatever it may be. It can be a disaster in their home, car accident, illness, just the whole 9 yards of life. We're constantly having to help people navigate. And most recently, what I've really been kind of compassion about, and I feel like it's sort of thickened up my toolbox in recognizing the power of connection and having a good open space for people to communicate, has been working with people in grief recovery. And I've done recovery ministry for folks who were faced with not only addiction, like you classically would think of in terms of 12 steps, but the lingo we used in our recovery ministry for 3 years was whatever hurts, habits, or hangups are making your life unmanageable. So in that, we dealt with people with anger management issues, depression, things that have just fractured their life. And for someone else, maybe it's not so problematic, it's manageable, but they have something that's gotten out of control and unmanageable. And how do you create a safe space for them to process that in, so that healing can happen and occur? And I think that's really what kind of has led John and I to have a conversation in this context of, like John said, how does the theoretical where does the rubber meet the road with that theoretical when people's lives are, they're broken? And it's this conversation kind of stemmed out of a recent one for John and I, where I was going through something difficult, and I was saying, I take for granted the tools that I have, and I don't realize everyone else has them. That a lot of times people are, the tools they have for dealing with trauma are, they have an old rusty screwdriver and they're trying to drive a nail with it. And like, that's all they got to turn to in the box. And, they desperately need some good tools and know how to use those tools effectively. So I think that's kind of what brings us there. I mean, I can flesh that out more, John, if you want, but
Yeah, yeah, we'll do that in a minute, John. I also curious about, your understanding of like how the nature connection side of things influences self-connection and people connection.
Yeah, early on, I actually vividly remember a talk with you, John. This was probably 5 or 6 years into knowing you, and we were on another Art of Mentoring. And one of the things we noticed was that, at that time, I think you called it the wall of grief, where people would be learning and growing in their connection with nature, and then suddenly it would be almost like crises seemed to be unraveling in their life, and that wasn't really the case. What happened was, as they were spending more and more time in nature, and they were building these tools of observation, of looking at nature and stilling their heart and mind and sort of our normative cognitive processes to just be in a open place of observation, and try to, I'm going to use the word, observe without judgment. And I don't mean that in a good, bad judgment way, but without layering a lot of cognitive filters on top of it, just try to take in raw data. I started to realize that what was happening was they were building this tool set of observation, particularly of pattern recognition and of cause and effect patterns. Well, what they didn't realize is that they unintentionally began to do that to themselves, so like they were practicing that out in nature, and nature was giving them an ideal setting to be grounded and undistracted by lots of artificial things. So that put them in an open kind of non-judgmental space themselves, and they were practicing these skills. But it's not like they turn those off. They started applying them to themselves, and suddenly they become hyper aware of what's going on internally for them, externally for them, and it kind of bring them a little bit to a crisis. I won't say it brought them to a crisis. What it did is brought them aware to the unresolved and the crises things, or the patterns that were broken in their life. And suddenly it's like, now what do I do with that? So I think nature, it was both a matter of, as people learn and seek to connect with nature, in particularly in the kind of tools and methodology that John has brought forth over the years, they're learning this non-judgmental kind of ability to step back and look at something from outside, stripped of a lot of judgment, but also a lot of defensiveness. It puts them in a very open space. And so it's a combination of being in that space that receives them well, and building tools along the way that help them to be able to do self-observation and self-awareness, but do it in a way where things are back, just far enough. Like I have said in counseling people in grief, that as they get tools, what's going to happen is you'll still find that you have grief, but grief doesn't have you, and that I've seen that for so many other things. And I can't take credit for that. I had a friend going through cancer, and I said, so how are you doing? And she said, well, you know what? I have cancer, but cancer doesn't have me. Because she was able to give herself enough cognitive and emotional distance from that to realize I'm not my cancer, or you could just as easily say, I'm not my mom's death. I'm not my divorce. I'm not my, you fill in the blank, but you feel it becomes your identity if you don't have that skill set. And then you're disempowered and you're overwhelmed and things get in this sort of spiral of erosion. So I feel like the tools that John has come up with and what I have seen in ministry that parallel those and or have taken tools that John has honed, when you put those in place, it allows for that spiral descent. You put the brakes on it and hopefully create a spiral of ascent, a trend reversal in that, mainly by creating a space where they can have that non-judgmental presence with themselves and others, and then begin to work whatever the problem may be, but from a productive space instead of just driven by old patterns. So I'll pause there. I get all, me, I'll riff on forever.
Yeah, no, that was a really, really good distillation of how, the nature and human culture thing work together. As one of our mutual friends, Matt Goff, who John and I work with in a project called Village Talk on a pretty regular basis. Matt talks about a tripod being very much more stable than either 4 legs or 2 legs. That the tripod is stable, provided that the 3 legs are the same length. And he always makes the point that, if you get a lot of nature connection, but you don't work on your people connection and self connection, then the tripod is unstable. In the same way, if you're only working on the people connection and you don't have the nature connection or self connection, it's unstable, right? That you need to have a balance between being connected to yourself, connected to other people, and connected to the natural world. And now why? Because people say, well, why do I have to connect to nature? I like people, I can just hang out with them. Well, it has to do with some things that John was pointing out. He was talking about building a tool set from being in nature, because nature essentially is if it's windy and rainy and cold, it doesn't feel welcoming, but when we go into nature on a pleasant day, it feels very welcoming to who we are, except just as we are, just like, the wild turkey over there is accepted as the wild turkey. The tree is accepted as the tree. Everybody just coexists with total acceptance, right? It's a very welcoming space. And you hear that over and over from people everywhere around the world. So that it trains your nervous system to understand that feeling of welcomeness. Now, what can often happen is when people have that, they know the feeling of, I always feel welcome in nature. I feel I'm not being judged, as John said. I can just expand. I can open here, right? When I go back home and then I suddenly get hit with all this noise, sort of people projecting on me or expecting things from me or holding me in older stories of myself, the opposite happens, so then people come to the kind of the wrong conclusion, honestly. I mean, I can understand why they get to that conclusion, but nature is good, people aren't so good, right? My problems come from people, not from nature, right? So, but what you have to do is realize, well, wait, no, that feeling of welcome openness that we get from nature is possible with people. What can I learn from my experiences in nature and bring into my family? And that's where the rubber meets the road. So on the way from, okay, nature is very welcoming, I can be myself. Okay, I'm going into my house where I can't really be myself safely. On the way, if you want to actually transmute that household feeling, you have to look here, you have to look inward, you have to do the inner tracking. What am I holding on to? What stories do I have? What projections do I have that are going to shortchange or cause, habits of disruption, disconnection in my family system or in my team or, in my community? So that's, an example of the 3 legs of the stool. Nature gives my nervous system, honestly, the ability to unfurl and feel welcome and feel open. Now I got to look inside and see how do I welcome myself, essentially? How can I feel welcome in any setting, no matter what people are projecting on me? Can I maintain that feeling I had in nature and understand, as John said, if I'm using those outer observation skills from awareness and tracking what's going on externally, turning that inward, and then learning how to hold that balance in that space when I enter back in into the human situation, right? So I just wanted to tie that up because, I threw that around in the beginning, and then, if people weren't paying attention, they may not have made the bridge to what we mean by, people connection, self connection, nature connection, and how these things can really work with each other, right? Yeah, any reflections on that, John?
No, all I could think of at the front end of that was I saw someone say, I, I want to be the person my dog thinks I am. It's like, you go out in nature and you want to be that person you feel you are when you're out in nature, and you're not pushed around by, you're not feeling defensive or pushed around by expectations, and you're in that warm, open, loving space. So
Exactly.
not very profound, but I think we can all resonate with that.
Right on. That's fantastic. Well, let me just show you some tools here that and John and I were distilling, and this is a longer conversation, that references of just a short 5-minute introduction that we've given to the folks on in collaborative practice in the Bay Area, with Peter and Launer, because I couldn't be there live, on that day. But John and I were just worked on this because we were looking at, there's literally hundreds of tools for building connection, hundreds of them, and I've gathered them. I actually have a project called 512 Project, meaning that I've identified 512 of these various tools that can be applied in family systems, in community and teams, to build connection to self, nature, and other people. So, when John and I were talking about it, we're like, well, okay, in your work as a pastor, what are the top, the top 10, so to speak? And we came up with these 9, and John very wisely sorted them into 3 categories. And I'll share that, I'll share this with you right now. And we'll make the PDF available for you. But John said, well, these 3 break into 3 triads. There's the openness triad, which John was referring to, I was referring to, the welcoming that nature gives us, that opens up our senses, allows us to be ourselves, allows us to relax and get into this very baseline state that the nervous system just loves to be in. It's just a really balanced and harmonized. And of course, it requires that we pay attention. So you'll see down at the bottom, that awareness and outer tracking. Paying attention with all our senses is part of this. Wiping off the road dust simply means, if you have a bunch of people coming together, for a counseling session or a grief session, as John does, you don't just sorry, I want to sit down and just go right into it, right? There's a period where you want to wipe off the road dust, help them shake off the day, shake off the travel, shake off the little bit of the trauma that they're holding so that they can feel safe. And John, talk about that a little bit, because you were talking to me about, how you use this, welcoming and road dust routine in your congregation through that grief share.
Yeah, I almost always, well, I'll just flat out welcome folks in a verbal way, but I always to take and give people an opportunity to say kind of how the week's gone. Sometimes it'll be, what are highs and lows you've had this week? Is there been anything particularly difficult? Is there anything distracting you right now? And sometimes every week in worship, I do this just by asking people. It can be done very rapidly. Take a deep breath, and as we let go of that breath, what's distracting you right now? And can we set that to the side so we can be fully present here, and just give people a moment of pause to kind of go, oh, where am I? Like, I know I'm in this room, but am I in this room right now? And fully. And it's really important to be able to have both a clean conversation in as much as possible that is not distracted. Sometimes just by naming, you may not be able to set those things down, but just by naming them, they can get disempowered. It gives you that just enough distance to where doesn't end up driving. If you came in and you're frustrated and upset over something that happened that morning, it's going to be able to be difficult for you to hear and process and be present to what's going on there. So it just gives people an opportunity to say, I'm not doing so well today, or, it's a great week, whatever that may be. And gratitude in a way then creates a pivot. To me, that's really a pivot point where it helps kind of draw a line. I think the welcome begins to do that, but boy, when you let go of what's distracting you, then you move toward gratitude, which is getting you in a present tense space, right? You know, if I say, how are you doing, almost inevitably, or how was the week, everyone's reflecting back and looking what was on the road, right? What was behind us, what's brought us here. But the moment you say, what are you grateful for, you're shifting now into a present tense state, which is where you need to be able to process well and cleanly. So to me, that's a nice, there's a progression to that creates a nice pivot. First to just let go of distraction and hopefully begin to, in some ways, I feel like you're setting the stage to be able to disarm the alarm system that we have in place, our defense mechanisms. You're not quite there yet. I think the next piece really does that.
Yeah. So you're basically, and when John says he's using words to welcome people, I know John, he's also being very present himself. He's like standing in that place he would feel when he's in nature. I am the version of myself that the dog thinks I am. Right.
Yeah.
So you're welcoming from that really, like, hey, I'm fully present. Like before you arrived, I wiped off my own road dust. I
Yeah.
gave my own gratitude so I could be fully open. So when I say welcome, you actually feel me welcoming you. Right. So there's also a state that we cultivate when we welcome. Right.
Yeah. Because you have to be in that state and place yourself, almost as like a tent peg that things can tether to, like you have to be grounded. Otherwise, I think people feel that, and you can't be fully present and responsive in a way that's,
Right. Yeah, it actually feels off-putting if someone's welcoming you, but they're not really present.
yeah, yeah. If you walk through the door of my house and I say, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you," and I'm on my phone responding to 3 texts and doing the dishes, it doesn't feel quite so welcoming, right?
It
So,
doesn't disarm that alarm system you were talking about.
no, not at all. You got to grab that phone and go, "No, hey, it's so good to see you. How are you?" Right? You could probably
Exactly.
feel that. You could probably feel that even over video.
I totally felt that. Yeah, you sent a wave of shivers over me when you shifted like that. That's great. All right, cool. So that's the openness, try the triad right there, right? So you're basically at that point, you're creating the container, right?
Right.
So I'm imagining in the grief share, people are parking in the parking lot. Some of them might be strangers to each other. Maybe they just lost their husband of 50 years. There's a lot of vulnerability, really, right?
Yeah.
And I'm imagining in a collaborative practice setting where, there's a divorce about to happen, there's attorneys present, there's coaches for each of the husband and the wife, and then there's the neutral financial person holding that space in the center. Like there's a lot, like, oh my God, there's a lot of tension, right?
Right.
And what we're doing with that first little triad there, and it might take 15, 20 minutes. People might need to use the bathroom and get a drink of water, or they're really starving, so you give them a little snack, right? You got to be able to get them settled, right? But that little 20-minute investment makes such a huge difference, right? Because now when you go into the next stage of the container, you're going deeper into connection. So these were 3 things that that John identified in our conversation about what really works within the grief share thing, the connection phase. So,
Yeah.
what do you want to say about that, John?
Well, I'll just add one other thing. If you're meeting multiple times with folks, when the grief support group that I run, we run in 13-week cycles, and there's no guarantee everybody's going to be back. We let come and go as you feel led, but I intentionally take almost the entire first 2-hour session we have together. It's probably, it's probably 2/3 spending time on openness, right? Because we're building that initial connection, and there's almost very little of the last triad that we'll get to in the first meeting or two. And I find it's necessary to really, you may have to front load that. And then as you meet repeatedly, then you can kind of begin to invert that. It's almost a funnel at first. where the biggest part of it needs to be openness, because particularly the first time you meet, whatever it may be for, John's 100% right. People walk through that door and you can see it physically on them. You know, have I made a mistake? Should I be here? Are they going to ask me to speak? You know, are they going to think, you know, because they already feel alone, they already feel isolated, they already feel defensive. And you really have to give that, if you'll give that an inordinate amount of time, the first time or two, it allows you to very rapidly then, you know, by a fourth or fifth session or a third or fourth session, I can just say, how's everybody doing this week? And they kind of pop off with it, and they're ready to be there, you know, right? So I just want to, as a, getting back to that sort of where does the rubber meet the road in the very practical of this, you almost have to overdo that openness triad when you first begin to meet with people. In fact, it may be your whole first meeting, basically, is just getting to know one another and knowing that this is a safe space, and then laying out kind of, I'll call them rules of engagement, if you will. That sounds bad because it sounds almost militaristic or whatever. But you know, what are the bumper guards of safety in this? You know, for me, then you have to move into that once they really feel safe.
Right, and that gets us into the connection component. But
Yep.
then we also talked about, you know, you just essentially mentioned peaceful discourse, right? The rules of engagement, right?
Yeah.
That these things are important for the realization component, but they're also important for the openness. They're also important for the connection, right? So
Yeah.
these three on the bottom are present in openness and they're present in connection. This is what's going on within the individual. This is that self-connection component here,
100%.
right? So unconditional listening is basically what that sounds like, right? When you know John is speaking, I'm not thinking about what it is I'm going to say next. You know, John and I are both practicing these tools, even here on Zoom. I know we are because we've been doing this for a long time together. In the same way, you know, when someone's sharing, you're not like over there thinking about, okay, well, okay, I hear a sound, and the sound is a person talking, womp, 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 womp. And I'm going to use that womp, 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 you know, to actually, you know, give myself a chance to think about stuff, you know, like that's not what we're talking about. We're literally talking about listening as if you're in nature. You're just there, putting out your senses and just going into the most quiet place within, because that person on the other side who's sharing is gonna feel psychic pushback, literally, intuitively, if people are thinking about other stuff when they're talking. They're gonna feel their story is not landing, and it hits them in the pit of their stomach, and their alarm system goes off again, right? So you're just listening unconditionally. As John said, you know, an example, that phone is off, that phone is away. That's just one example of distraction from conversation. But really, we encourage people. Okay, I don't know how to listen like that. No one ever listened to me like that, which is, you know, we were talking earlier about people who don't have tools in their toolbox. They only have that one rusty screwdriver that they're trying to use as a hammer. They didn't grow up in a family where unconditional listening was offered to them. So they don't know what it feels like. They don't know how to do it for others. And you have to understand that that's common. So you have to work on that a little bit. I often will introduce in the connection triad, hey, let's all just kind of close our eyes for a second and listen as far off to the right as you can. And now listen far off to the left and listen for the quietest sound in both those directions, right? People just get real quiet. And then I'm like, now listen out in front of you. Now listen out behind you at the same time for the quietest sound. It might be the hum of the refrigerator in the other room, or it might be like the sound of cars through the walls or whatever in the building. And then I say, okay, now let's listen to all four of those directions, left, right, front, back, and just get people into this really quiet space with their eyes closed. And then I'll say, okay, you feel what it feels like right now when we're all in that space together? Let's try to return to that when someone's sharing. I want to encourage us to go back to that space of unconditional listening. And what I might often say is if I start to notice people like falling back into their habits of disconnection, I'll just take a break for a second. I'll say, all right, let's all take a deep breath, you know, and let's go back and practice that listening thing again, right? And get them to hold that space of listening. And it might take a couple of times of doing that before they actually can settle into that. But boy, do the people who are sharing into that space appreciate it, because they just feel no pushback. They feel free to share, and they start to say things that even surprise them that they're saying, right? Because of that unconditional listening space. What's your experience with that, John?
Oh, this is something I have to revisit with our facilitators regularly, because we can begin to get uncomfortable with the conversation ourselves going on. And here's where I see this play out in a negative way, is where a facilitator can feel the angst of someone and they want to rescue them. So they start offering advice and they're no longer listening at that point. And I ran into this in a really powerful way. And I had to have a little debrief with my facilitators, where I had a mother who'd lost her daughter. And she started to say, you know, I wonder, am I still a mom now that my daughter's gone? And she raised that up. Very vulnerable thing to say, right? To sit in this group and say, am I a mom now? And there was one woman, and then several people dog piled in this moment. She opened her mouth. One facilitator said, oh, yeah, you're still a mom, and the moment she did that, it shut down the envelope of listening. That person was not in that space to feel safe asking that question because they got corrected. I mean, it was an intention to be helpful, but we don't necessarily feel love corrected if it's not handled well, and that's emotionally, I'm sure, what happened for her, because I just watched her physically sort of withdraw. And I was, fortunately I saw it and I was able to kind of circle back and say, I want to revisit. I kind of had to push pause on the facilitators. I can't remember how I did that, but I just said, I kind of want to circle back and revisit. You asked a really important question, and I had to bring it back to what she was feeling about that. But that's where it's really interesting as facilitators, where we have to be careful about our own thing. It goes back to John talking about if we haven't welcomed ourselves yet, we can't be there fully. It's really an extension of that. That unconditional listening, we have to really fully be in the room. In one way, John, in a practical sense, that we do that to verbally cue it. I love what you said about bringing people back to their physical senses, because if you can invite people to breathing, or if you can invite them to sensory awareness, those are present tense, and they push pause on the cognitive conditional things going on, because you can't really be present and paying attention to your physical sentences and simultaneously be spiraling in that conditional, mode, or your breath, because your breath is only present tense. You never say, well, remember how you were breathing 6 minutes ago. So, pay attention to your breath. It's present tense, right? But what I was going to say about that is, we verbally do that a little bit from the get-go when we create a space of asking people that when people are sharing, by and large, let's not crosstalk, either talk with one another while they're talking, because then they're not, they feel they're not being heard, or offering advice. If you ask questions that help you ask authentic, curious questions about what they're experiencing and feeling, so that they feel listened to. Well, they are listened to. It's not a matter of just feeling it, so that they are listened to. The other thing I will say, particularly when we're dealing with conflict, I have to deal with and be the mediator of a lot of conflict in the life of the church, whether it's just people on committees or, things that arise within the community. And I have found from experience that people can deeply disagree, but if they feel heard, they can be okay with that. It really that simple sometimes. If someone, I've had many a vote where someone wound up being kind of an outlier, and they were okay with it because they felt everyone heard their concern and they felt respected in it. Nevertheless, they just knew we had an earnest disagreement that we weren't going to resolve. But the reason they were okay with that, they felt that their concerns weren't dismissed. They felt heard. They felt understood, whether they were agreed with or not. So that's to me and that really bridges all of those three things in that triad of unconditional listening, culture of allowance, of accepting people where they are. Maybe they need a minute to talk about something that seems off subject. That's okay. We're going to welcome them anyways with that and allow that. And being able to mirror back to people that you're listening. Sometimes it's as simple as it's just mirroring, just saying, that sounds this way, or what I hear you saying is that when you come home now and your husband's not there, you just feel really alone. And all I've done is I'm just making sure that I did hear and understand them. And just by repeating it back sometimes, mirroring that, they go, yeah, you get it. Like at that point we have connection, because
Exactly.
not only they feel like they're throwing it out there, but there's part of unconditional listening, I think, is giving pause to make sure you did understand and you did hear, because that's when the connection happens, is when their hearing gets validated at some level. They know they were heard because you could either voice it back. And sometimes you're off base, and that's great, because when you mirror it back and you say, well, man, that sounds like that was really hard. And they go, oh, no, no, no. Like, I am so relieved. And you're like, oh, okay. And now it becomes a give and a take, and there's connection there, because now, they haven't, in the first scenario where I mirror back, they lob the ball and they know I've caught it. When you get that give and take going on, now we're playing catch, right?
Nice. Yeah. A good metaphor. So that's John's talking now about that lifting up people's gifts and honoring shares, as that third part of connection, right? And that culture of allowance, as he said, was, hey, maybe they're talking about something that seems really off topic.
Yeah.
Or, why not allow that mother to say, am I a mother anymore? Just allow that, right? We don't
Yeah.
need to fix it. We don't need to give advice. We don't need to put a condition on it, right? We're
Right.
allowing that. And people really feel that. And as John said, I'll turn off the screen share for 1 second just so I can, have the bigger view. The grandmother Shore Charnot from the Odawa tribe up in the Great Lakes region, shares this 9,000-year-old wisdom, that everybody has the need to be seen, number one. And this is deeply in harmony with interpersonal neurobiology, the work of Dan Siegel, right? Everyone has the need to know that they are seen, that they are heard and understood. And John made good point about that one. That they are contributing, and being in conversation in a good way is contributing, and that their contribution is valued. And so, seen, heard, and understood, contributing, valued, and the last one is belong. They will naturally feel like they belong, that they are safe. Those are what are called the five needs. And I think it's just such a fantastic ancient tool, but it's also completely backed up by modern interpersonal neurobiology work there. So that was a great example, John. All right, well, let's look at the last triad, which is the triad of realization. And again, remember, this is as much as anything, the self-connection part. This is the one that is with us every step of the way, right? We have to have a peaceful discourse with ourselves in order to be able to welcome. We have to have that peaceful discourse with ourselves in order to help people wipe off that road dust. Because if we're not receiving their stories and helping them wipe their road dust, they'll just hold on to that tension that they walked in with, right? And as John already said, gratitude brings you straight into peaceful discourse. It brings you right into the moment. It puts you at the version of yourself that the dog thinks you are. I love that. That's going to stick with me. Inner tracking is a way for us to get back into peaceful discourse. Okay, I was feeling really good. Now suddenly I'm not. What happened inside me that I can track using that awareness and outer tracking that I learned in my nature awareness? Now I'm applying it to myself, as John said way back at the beginning. And these three tools within us that everybody is also sharing just makes this whole container go deeper and stronger and actually pretty quickly. It's pretty remarkable how fast people can connect. When we ran these courses around the world called the Art of Mentoring, we were basically simulating an intergenerational village. You know, everybody came in, they pulled a piece of paper out of a basket at the registration table that gave them a group that they were in and a value that they were holding, right? So the whole village was modeling these 9 tools. But they all, you know, everyone was trained in these last 3, but we were constantly doing things in nature and then bringing it back into group settings. And then when the whole village got together, you know, people after day 3 would say, and this one guy that flew in from the United Kingdom to follow this program because he heard it was really transformative, and he was a guy that collected, you know, transformative leadership programs. Like that's what he did. He was a CEO consultant, and he just figured he was the guy who knew all the best tools. And he brought himself and his 2 sons after a very, very traumatic divorce. The mother basically abandoned the family and left him with his 2 sons, and they just come off of that experience. They ended up going to the Art of Mentoring, and he said at the end of it, he said, you know, I consider myself kind of a connoisseur of transformation and leadership. He said, but I don't know what's going on here because I can't tell where it's coming from. It doesn't seem to be in the curriculum. It's not what people were saying on the whiteboard, although some of it was, some of it wasn't. But this is the single most transformational experience of mine and my son's life, and this has been tremendously healing. What were you doing? and then he said, the other thing he said was, the thing I don't understand is why you do this 7 days a year and take 358 off. Don't you think you should reverse that? And I said, well, now that's a really interesting question. And I said, well, I don't actually know how to do that because this takes a lot of setup to get this week-long thing to run, you know, because you get all kinds of staff who have to be really embodied in these skills behind the scenes to train all these small groups so that every participant starts walking around with these 9 simple tools. But boy, that's all it takes to make a huge transformation in people's lives when they're in a container, you know, multi-generation container, children to elders, you know, and everything in between, who came in as strangers, you know, by the end of the week, they feel like family. Um, so, you know, that's my reflection on that. But John, what's your reflection on those realization tools there?
Well, it was striking me as you were talking that you mentioned you need a good team around this, and that there's work you have to do that. When you're a facilitator and you're working in a process like this, people don't have those tools, and you sort of have to be their surrogate tool holder. You know, I find that I have to kind of do their inner tracking for them, if you will. You know, like I have to look at them, and then they're in the middle of something, say, you know, I noticed when you started talking about your mom a moment ago, you had this hitch in your throat. What was going on then? You know, like that's blending that inner and outer tracking that they can't do for themselves, maybe necessarily at the beginning. And so there's a real need to be kind of a tool holder for people, because they're probably not in their box, or they're just so overwhelmed in what they're dealing with, they can't consciously at first do that. You know, they can't get enough distance to be able to do that. So that was one thing that really struck me about the tools is you have to, it's not just modeling them, but you really almost like with a small child, the first time they're using an electric drill, you like literally have to put your hands on their hands, right? And steady the drill. You know, like you can't just go, here it is, you know, press that button and go. Like there's a lot of it's beyond modeling. It's walking with them in doing the tool,
It's
right?
mentoring. Yeah.
It's really mentoring. It's a deep relationship. It's not a matter of here's how you do it. It's let's do this together, and coming into that in a good-hearted way. So that's really important in that process. seems like there was another piece, and I'm sure I'll circle back to it. But yeah, those tools, they take some playing around with, but they're very simple though. They're not complex. You just have to remind them and keep them front and center as you're doing process with people, and really suspend a lot of self. I will say that. You have to suspend so much self and really let your outer awareness be on them. Even as I say that though, you've got to be inner tracking, because people, their stuff's going to rub against your stuff, and you know, and you got to be mindful of that. And sometimes, yeah, you're doing this dance between applying tools to them, applying to yourself all at once, and it gets messy, you know. But you can always, I think it was beautiful what John said, you can always push pause, you know. things start to fray out, push pause, literally, let's take a break, let's all stand up, shake it off a little bit, you know. I'm sensing that, you know.
I often send people outside in that moment, say, hey, why don't you just take 5 minutes and just go for a little wander, just go into your senses and take a breath and just kind of feel, why are you grateful for what's around you, and you just kind of return. You know, that's really important to recognize when it's time to do that, right? Go back to the openness triad, essentially, right?
Yeah. And you know, you probably, when you're initially using tools like this, you probably almost need to artificially build that in, like plan on it. Like, you know, I kind of do that in Grief Share. We have an opening, and part of an element of our model is we always watch a video of some experts and some kind of stories of folks. But that's that's a built-in pause, you know, because we're at it for 2 hours. And I say, hey, while I queue up the video, let's all just take a break. And if you need some water, need to use the restroom, and, you know, we've got some refreshment. And it sort of builds that in, because this is intense. You know, you kind of need to have the foot on the gas for a little while and then pump the brakes, you know, like there's a lot of pacing involved, and that gets easier with time, but you can always just go back to the tools, you know, the tools work themselves if you work the tools. And I think in a very fundamental way, I guess if I had to put this all in almost something pithy, over the years as pastor, we have this saying where we always say, you know, people don't care what you know unless they know you care.
I love that. Yeah.
You know, so, you know, and this is where they've got to feel the caring, know the caring. And really, I find the healing is in completing and holding the container. If we can just get people in a healthy space, we are miraculously made where healing will happen of its own accord. You just need to have a healthy environment. Like anything else, create a healthy environment, you'll have healthy growth. So I'll pause.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Well, I just want to, first of all, thank you all for what you're doing, because I know you're in service to families in the same way that John is. And I just am really always humbled to be able to work with people that do this for a living, that they put themselves in service to try to find a good way to build unity and connection in families and communities. So thank you all for what you do. You know, if you found this video, then you can also see there's resources below. I'm pointing you at some of those 512 project videos that go into more detail on the things that are on here. So have at it. And yeah, John, thank you so much for taking time. Really appreciate it. And I love this work. I love that we can talk about it. And I know we'll continue to do that as long as we live. So thank you all.